Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back for another appearance, Evan Levy, today on the podcast. We're going to discuss some data governance topics and questions, mostly because Evan's going to be alongside Deanne Larson, uh, hosting a data bootcamp, a data governance bootcamp for us in October. But of course, Evan has been on this podcast in the past. I encourage everyone to go back and listen to his talks with me about data strategy. So we're going to pivot a little bit away from that today. But Evan, always a pleasure to have you on the podcast again. How are you doing today? Thanks for joining.
I'm doing great, and I appreciate the opportunity to sit down and chat with you about something that's more exciting than sliced bread and weather, data governance.
Well, I will. I mean, you joke, but I feel like it's more and more the hotter topic than maybe ever before. So maybe, Evan, I think a good place for us to start here is to just frame everything. What is data governance in your opinion? I know that definitions are always a little different for everyone in this industry, it seems, but maybe you can help us out by defining data governance.
Yeah, I'll certainly offer up some definitions. The thing that I would tell you is what's not only important is understanding what it is. It's like, why are you doing it? At the end of the day, it's really about fixing data problems. And whether you're a purist on what the discipline is or a purist on definitions, really the definition of doing this is, or why we do this, or the driver of it is, it's fixing broken data, making it usable. So I actually have a couple of definitions I'll steal from others, and I'll give you my definition. At Microsoft, a fairly well-known company in that small little sector called software, says data governance is the collection of processes, policies, roles, metrics, and standards that ensures an effective and efficient use of information. Um, Google says is everything you do to ensure data is secure, private, accurate, available, and usable. It includes the actions people must take, the process they must follow, and the technology that supports them throughout the data lifecycle. Those are a lot of words. And realistically, what I think when it comes to what is data governance, if you first think about just the way our government is supposed to work, it's so we can get along, so we know how to interact with each other, and it's also a series of processes or methods that when we run into a conflict, we have a means or an ability to resolve that conflict and come up with whatever the new rule or legislation is. So what is data governance? It's the rules and details involved with sharing data. If all our data was contained in a single system, we wouldn't have to worry about what things are called because there would only be one name. We wouldn't have to worry about how it's defined or who's allowed to see it because, again, it would be controlled by one thing or one place. The reason we need data governance, and the reason I say it's all about sharing data, is data governance becomes very, very visible when I have to move data from one system to another, or have to share it across different individuals or different organizations. And there might be some level of sensitivity, whether it's in the government, the top secret or classified, whether it's in the commercial world and just personal data. So, really, data governance is what are the rules and the methods and the policies around sharing data?
That was excellent. And I do appreciate you breaking that down in more layman's terms because those first two definitions were a little heavy there. So
Oh,
you're always great at making those translations for someone like me to understand. Okay, so now that we understand what data governance is, can you offer up maybe some real world examples for where data governance is visible in daily life, maybe outside of just what we're talking about in the data and analytics industry?
well, some people like to characterize themselves as the data guru or the data czar. I probably characterize myself as a data crackpot because I try and find humor in everything. But I'll give you a very simple example. Think about you go off and you buy a suit. Maybe you go buy 3 suits. And let's say you spend some serious money and you spend 10 grand on 3 suits. So you can see as I'm dressed today, that's not likely, but nonetheless, let's just say for purposes of discussion, you go off and you buy 3 suits. Well, there's a lot of details about this. And I guess my first question would be, would you really care if someone knew that you spent 10 grand on 3 suits? Now, the fact is, you might not care if your spouse knows. You probably wouldn't make a big deal if a coworker knew because you may have shared that with them. But you probably don't want your boss, if you've got a raise or a compensation review, to know that. You probably don't want a neighbor who it's none of their business what you make or what your compensation is of what you're spending on stuff. So really, there's a set of rules about just sharing that information, what would make you comfortable or what would make you uncomfortable. And the fact is, those things really aren't written down. But if I drill into this a little bit further, let's talk about this suit. And let's say you're a 40 regular, which for men, it's really about your chest size, and if you're 40 regular, there's some well-defined details about what the cuff length is and the tail, or how well. Who decides what a 40 regular is or a 40 long? Whether something's in a big and tall store or it's a regular, or better yet, what about the name of the colors? I mean, one example is, think about a Chevy. Let's just say a Corvette. A blue Corvette probably is actual different color between 1965 and 1975 and 1995 and 2015.
Hmm.
So the color is actually very dependent upon the model year and the model. And again, who makes those decisions? And if someone decides, something, we're coming out with the 2024 model Corvette, this is what we want blue to look like. Well, what's the process that goes into defining a new value and then determining, well, who's allowed to change it or modify it? And then the whole issue of, well, where do we store that information to make it available to everybody else? And do we call it size? Do we call it color? Do we call it tint? What do we call those things? And I mentioned that because all of this really falls under the umbrella of what is data governance. And the reason I bring that up is, some people would say, well, that's data management, that's data administration, that's data governance. I made the remark at the beginning, at the end of the day, it's about fixing stuff. And really what you want to be able to do is, okay, how do I make sure that the parties that are involved with data governance actually know that they can participate and resolve the problem, and there's some level of decision authority. The thing that I tell people is, the reason you have data governance is because the management hierarchy, it doesn't work. And it's not that it's dysfunctional. Most management hierarchies are very, very focused on a particular function and the organization that owns it. So on pricing, you have an organization inside your company that decides what pricing is. And when it comes up with new products, well, there's a well-defined organization that does that. But when details cross organizational boundaries, because multiple groups participate in this, that's where governance is necessary, because there's not a single management hierarchy to make the decision. So you tend to need data governance, that means of interacting with each other and establishing rules, so the right people can come to the table and say, we're going to call this blue, so everybody understands, well, the guys that have to buy the clothing dye, the guys that actually dye the cloth, the people that manufacture the suit, so they know which ones get this type of blue and which ones get this other type of blue, and so forth. So why you have data governance, which you didn't ask, but I want to cover, is because your management hierarchy doesn't support this cross-functional need, and because there's all these details that you want to make sure everyone's familiar with.
Again, I think that those analogies are perfect, and I wish, Evan, that you and I had this conversation a couple years ago, right when I started working with TDWI, because I think I would have learned a lot from you, and could have saved myself a lot of hemming and hawing over different things and terminologies. But I think a good follow-up question there is, if you're an organization, kind of bringing it back into the industry here. How
Sure.
would you know if you need data governance? It sounds like it should be maybe inherent to most folks to say, oh, this is maybe something that we should automatically know that we need. But how do you know that you need it?
Well, the thing to keep in mind is, let's think about the rules and laws that we have in everyday life. If I have two cars in a city, do I really need stoplights and interchanges and traffic cops? Probably not, because there's two people. You look out and they don't hit one another, you're fine. When you find that you need data governance is where you have a lot of individuals struggling with using and sharing data. So you're implicitly always doing governance, but I think the real issue is, do I need to have a governance program, an
Hmm.
official or an institutionalized governance program addressing things? And the first step is, well, do you have data problems? Do you have issues that don't seem to get resolved because it's not one player, there's multiple players? I mean, the inevitable discussion of, okay, this data is wrong. Well, in our company, the source system is supposed to fix the data. The source system people say, well, not my responsibility, because if it's keyed in wrong, there's nothing I can do. Ding, ding, ding. If you have an issue with data accuracy and there's not a clear owner of fixing that, well, you probably need data governance. There's circumstances where you run into where people have reports that have differing values for what sales or revenue or margin, because there's not an agreement on what the calculations are or where to get the data. So again, if you have that, someone would say, well, I can go build a data warehouse and solve that. Well, no, you can't. And the reason is you can go build a system, but how do you get everybody to use it? How do you get everybody to agree what those definitions are? And that's what governance brings to the table. The whole premise of an agreement of collaboration. So do you run into circumstances where things like reports have inaccurate values, where values aren't getting fixed, where people are using terminology indiscriminately and inaccurately? The idea, I worked at an insurance company where they had the concept of turnaround time, which was when a claim came in, was that actual well-defined calculation of when it was responded to. Now, the problem was, well, how do you deal with turnaround time if someone calls in at 4:59 p.m. on a Friday and you respond by 9:05 a.m. on Monday? Is that 6 minutes or is that 72 hours or whatever it might be? So what data governance would do under those circumstances is institutionalize rules and definitions and details to force the collaboration and agreement. So my simple one sentence is, if you have data problems, data governance can probably help you. It's really about, do you have conflict of what data problem resolution is?
Mm.
That's where data governance can help. And it's because you have a lot of people using data. You don't tend to see governance rear its need and visibility if all you do is standard reports. But when you get into things like self-service or people using and manipulating data themselves or making decisions, and they have questions about stuff, that's where the governance typically plays a very, very valuable role.
Right. And I think we're seeing a massive uptick in recent years of especially what you just touched on there, the self-service aspect. And then that's where that sharing data component
Oh,
comes into
sure.
play that you were just talking about there as well. So
Mhm.
I'm assuming with the wide variety of different companies and the wide ranging issues that might be happening with data and data sharing, there's probably a few different ways to go about handling data governance. Am I right in that assumption? Can you maybe
Yeah, well,
share some
there's
of those
two.
ways?
Yeah, well, there's two basic approaches, and you really want to fit it to the particular need. It's not that it can't be cookie cutter, but really, when you're trying to adjust or change the way people approach things, you want to make sure it fits well. And there's two basic approaches. One is top down. Now there's bottom up. This isn't rocket science. What you typically see with top down is someone in an executive or managerial level say, "Hey, you know something? I want something fixed." You often find that to be things like data integrity or data quality or finding things, data location, data catalog.
Hmm.
Well, the top down is, I've got an executive or a manager at some position in the organization that has the budget authority and the managerial organization authority to say, go do this, and people will follow. And that's very, very common with really large enterprise system implementations. If you ever see an SAP or a new
Hmm.
accounting system or a new transactional system, those are typically executive driven and they're top down. And what I mean by top down, it's someone at the top is pushing down, go do this to everybody else. The alternative is a bottom up approach, which actually is very common in the analytics and detailed data world, where I don't know if I've got a problem across the entire company, but what I really have is a problem that a small group that has tactical responsibilities can go off and fix. So, let's fix the data inside this report. We'll pull the data from the source system, we'll clean it up in our database, and now the values are accurate. And the bottom up is, okay, make it tactical, find a very simple success, fix what you can fix within your authority, and then share with others, because what you'll often find is these new methods or ideas that this one small team figured out, well, others will want it, whether it be envy or value, and they'll adopt it. And you often see data warehousing grow not by 20 and 30%, but by 200 and 300%, because someone sees the value of detailed data in the reports and they say, hey, I want some of that. So then the next group adopts it and the next group adopts it. And that's really what bottom up is. What you often find with data governance, because it's not well understood by a lot of folks, is it often starts as a bottom up activity, a grassroots, tactically driven need. And it's not uncommon for it to start with the BR analytics team because they see where all this data comes together and there are inconsistencies, so they fix it. And then it rises to a level of visibility because of the value they're delivering. And then an executive will pick up the ball and run with it and say, hey, I want more of this. Let's make this a bigger, broader initiative. So those are the two different approaches, and it's usually ends up being a bit of a hybrid. You start bottom up, you inevitably find a manager or an executive that's enthusiastic, and it evolves to being a top down.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. So within those two different approaches, is there like a list of basic components or pieces to the data governance within
Yeah.
those?
Well, I'm glad you asked because every data governance discussion always gets into, well, what's a rule? What's a term? What do I need to worry about? There's some basic parts in the same way that if you're going to fix something, you probably have a flathead screwdriver, you probably have a Phillips head screwdriver, you probably have a pair of pliers and a hammer and a few other things. There's some basic working tools to address governance. And right at the beginning, the most obvious is some sort of catalog that where you actually define terms and definitions and values. Now that seems a little obvious, but I often find a lot of governance programs or initiatives that want to start off trying to fix things. And they don't have that glossary of terms or dictionary of terms. And the
Mm.
reason that's so important is when you finally agree how to fix something, you need to record it someplace and you need to tie it to something. So if, for example, I have a problem where turnaround time isn't well defined, if we all sit around and agree and come to a very solid agreement, this is what turnaround time is, this is how we'll calculate it. Well, I put it in that glossary to institutionalize it so everybody can now refer to it. So as obvious as and simple as it sounds, without that, everything becomes hearsay. Everything becomes, well, I remember when we spoke, it's like, no, put it and record it someplace persistent.
Yeah.
So yeah, the first basic component is let me have some sort of basic terms, definitions, and values. Then what you're going to really have is what's called a rule. And it's really the details, the plain English details about how stuff works at a higher level than rules of policy. So a good example is you may have, and policy is really directionally oriented.
Mm.
The idea of we want all personal data to be protected. Okay, that would be a policy. We want data quality to be applied to all data. Again, that's a policy. It's very general direction. It's not the specifics of how to do something. It's more of a goal. Well, under policies, you actually have rules that detail that. The rule might be we correct all zip codes. We check all addresses to match postal service addresses. And there's a whole slew of rule types, very, very broad. There's another concept called standards, and I'll go over each one of these again just as a list, but the idea of a standard is really what's that North Star thing that we expect to always rely on. A lot of organizations, standards can be the way data is represented, or a variety of other details. So really, the reason I soft discuss standards is really just a rule. The
Mm.
whole thing that we cleanse and standardize all our data. Okay, so we've talked about terms, policies, rules, and standards. So those are the big four. Now, the fifth one is decision rights. The whole idea of, okay, we've come up with this rule, we've come up with this standard. How do we make sure that people adopt it, it's communicated, and the people that are in charge say, yes, we bless this, this shall be followed? That's what decision rights is all about. It tends to be implicitly understood when you have organizational management because the guy in charge or the gal in charge says this shall be and everyone follows.
Right.
But when you cross organizations, what is that decision authority? How many people do we need to get them to agree? Is it a democratic or an autocratic process? How is that done? And then make sure everybody adopts and accepts it. In much the same way, and in the United States government, there's certain rules about we need so many senators to approve something or so many representatives in Congress to approve something, and what the mechanism is to, again, that's all about decision rights.
Mm-hmm.
And then the final piece, which goes with decision rights, what's the process? How do I request a new rule? How do I request or submit a new term? So those are the six tools, the screwdrivers and hammers and pliers: business terms and a glossary, policies, rules, standards, decision rights, and process.
So I think you set the table beautifully for a lot of the components here that go into the data governance programs, and for folks that may want to be doing something along the lines of this in their own business. They might ask the final question of who is it that participates in this? Who are the people within the business that might be the ones that have to follow those six different
Yeah,
tools there.
yeah. I joke it's who's who in the zoo. Really, it all starts with that decision right idea.
Hmm.
Who is it from within the organization that's going to be prepared to say, I support and I'll stand behind this? And you typically put that group of people together as a data governance committee.
Mm.
You run into a lot of challenges of what the dividing line of what their authority, and details are, but let's not get into that. Just you need some sort of data governance committee of business leadership or ownership that says, okay, we've agreed to this, we're going to do it, I'm going to hold my staff accountable. So that's one group. The second is a data governance team, the technical folks that go figure out what the right solutions are, that figure out what to recommend. It's almost like I've got Congress and our federal government. Well, the Congress people and the senators, they don't write the laws. They have staff members that are very, very adept at doing those things. Those staff members are the data governance team, the developers to figure that stuff out. And they call on people if it's a traffic issue or a medical issue or something about cultural affairs, whatever it might be. Well, those are subject matter experts. And we have the same thing in the governance world. So really, you have a data governance steering committee of one form or fashion. You have the data governance team, and you have subject matter experts to contribute to that. And I'd say the only other role that's pretty important is actual individuals that want to participate, because ultimately, at the end of the day, who's going to submit and identify the problems? Those problems shouldn't be identified by a steering committee or a data governance team. It should be identified by the people whose work is being inhibited or affected by that. So, I mean, you could add other roles and details, but those are pretty much the most obvious ones.
Well, that's fantastic. And I feel like, Evan, I got a really good preview from you about this data governance boot camp that we are going to be having, that you're going to be instructing alongside Deanne Larson in October.
Mhm.
I know it's a 3-day course. Would you mind maybe sharing a little bit of more insight about what folks might, be in for if they sign up for this seminar, and if there is any
Sure.
sort of prerequisites to
Well,
signing up for this?
yeah, sure. There's no prerequisites. In fact, I think the only prerequisite is, do you want to learn about data governance? Now, the way things are split, there's actually what I characterize the fundamentals class or course material, where they talk about what is governance, the different roles, the different types of ideas and structures and things. And then the piece that I handle is basically how do you start and how do you do it? How do you find the people to participate? What is the plan? So I actually walk through in the 1-day class how to prepare and plan and build the activity. How do you deploy it? Because actually what you often find with data governance is the team that defines it isn't necessarily the people that deal with it on day to day. So what are all those activities, the details? How do you engage with end users? And then how do you monitor and measure it as you move forward? So it's really, what are the pieces, and then what are the tactics of execution?
Evan, as always, it's an absolute pleasure talking with you. I really appreciate your time today, and I know we'll be having another conversation soon. I rely on you usually once every few months, so if you don't mind keeping that door open for me, I would love to have you on again pretty soon.
I always look forward to it. You take care.
Awesome. Thanks again, Evan. To subscribe to the Speaking of Data podcast, or to learn more about TDWI's research and training on all things data management and analytics, visit tdwi.org or click the link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in.